Describes the dysfunctional one, describes the incident in which Esau sold his rights to his birthright as a firstborn, and subsequently it also narrates the blessings that Isaac intended to give to his elder son Esau, but instead the younger son, they were twins, Jacob, impersonated Esau and took those blessings, and what happened subsequently. So it's actually it's an interesting narrative. We're not going to have time to talk about every aspect of the narrative today, but what I would like to do is actually focus in on a few interesting points of the parsha, of the portion, that I think are relevant for us. I think the message is quite relevant. So actually, at the very, very beginning of the portion, we are told that Isaac married Rebekah, and Rebekah was barren for a while, for a number of years. And the Torah relates that both Isaac and Rebekah prayed to God that Rebekah should have a child, that she should become pregnant. Based upon the wording of the texts, which is a little bit ambiguous, our rabbis derive that they actually prayed near each other. One stood in one corner of the room and prayed, and the other stood in the other corner of the room and prayed. But yet the very next part of the next phrase of that verse indicates that God listened to his voice meaning Isaac. So the question is, if both Isaac and Rebekah prayed, and they were both very, very great people, right? Respectively, one of the forefathers and matriarchs of our people, why is it that God responded only to the prayer of Isaac and did not respond similarly to the prayer of Rebekah? So, most popular traditional commentary on the text, someone known by the name of Rashi, it's actually an abbreviation for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, lived in the 1000s. He quotes a rabbinic interpretation that says the following: God responded to the prayers of Isaac rather than those of Rebekah, because the prayers of a righteous person who was born into a righteous family are greater than those of a righteous person who was born into a not righteous family. It's not a gender issue, I want to emphasize that. It's not a matter of Isaac as the male, had his prayers answered, that he had any greater merit to have his prayers answered, but rather that Isaac grew up in what we call a religious home, a traditional Jewish, if I can use that word, right? Where Jewish came in to usage later, but was brought up in a traditional home, that of Abraham and Sarah, of course, also our founding forefather and matriarch, whereas Rebekah grew up in a home of people that were not committed to a moral lifestyle. Her father was Bethuel, and her brother was Lavan, who figures actually later on in the narrative, because later on we find that Jacob married two daughters of Lavan, Rachel and Leah. But he was not righteous, evidently, not described as righteous. Bethuel, the father, was not described as righteous. Rebekah certainly was, but since Rebekah did not grow up in that type of a home, a religious home, a moral home, therefore her prayers were less effective. The question is why? Not only is the question why, I don't understand why it is that we have this rabbinic tradition, but I would, if anything, I would argue the other way, right?
That's what I was going to say, that all the readings that I've done has always said the person who comes from a longer distance has had to journey and understand larger hurdles, and therefore God looks to him as the person who's...
Or her.
Yeah.
Yeah, him, not generically, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, him or her. Exactly. Exactly. And it's about this idea is also codified in Jewish tradition. We're told that the penitent can reach certain spiritual achievements, heights, that someone who was religious from birth, so to speak, committed from birth, cannot reach. Exactly. And one would imagine that that would certainly be true when it comes to the issue of prayer, because what is prayer? but communion with God. The person who has traveled a longer distance, very aptly put, presumably has developed in some ways perhaps a more deeply meaningful relationship with God than someone who was born into it. Exactly. Right. Good question. Good point. So there is a rabbi who lived in the 20th century who attempted to answer this question, and I think what he said is very profound. What he said is the following, is there is no doubt, and no one for a moment takes away the credit of the penitent who has traveled so far. The penitent has come so far in his or her spiritual quest, has prepared to undergo a change in lifestyle, etc. That person, no doubt, has a very, very strong, very close relationship with God. However, when it comes to the issue of prayer, prayer is one of those areas in our tradition that is actually a little tricky, because there is the concept in our tradition that prayer needs to become, in some ways, a routine. We're asked to pray daily. Traditionally, we pray actually 3 times a day, and certainly on Sabbath and holidays or whatever. So in that sense, prayer is supposed to be part of our habit. On the other hand, prayer is never supposed to become a routine, because prayer is supposed to be invested with a real, honest, heartfelt search for God, a really heartfelt search for meaning and for communion with God. And the question is attention there, right? How do you do that, right? It's easier, I would say. It's probably never easy, but it's easier to spontaneously attempt to develop that relationship, that sense of communication, of communion with God. It certainly is infinitely more difficult to try to do that on a schedule. Time is 12 o'clock. I got to commune with God. Very difficult to do, right? And this rabbi makes the very same point here. He says that Rebecca came a really, really long distance. And Rebecca could remember way back to her youngest days when she didn't have this opportunity to commune with God. So for her to be able to develop that sense of novelty, of supreme importance of communion with God, was something that came, I emphasize the word relatively easily to her. Isaac, on the other hand, never knew anything else. From his youngest days, he had these wonderful role models of his parents, Abraham and Sarah, was brought up with everything being in place in a certain sense spiritually, a spiritual home. Morning. So for an individual like that, to be able to manifest this real sense of connectedness with God was infinitely more difficult. And that's why it is. I'll summarize them all, by the way. Thank you for coming. That's why it is that his prayers, that Isaac's prayers, were as important as Rebecca's were. They were even a little bit more important to God. And I would just say, and again, I said I'll summarize in a minute, I would say that the lesson to be learned here is not that we're dealing here with two, polar examples here, two polar, what I'm looking for. All right. Polar examples of, someone who was, experienced religion, spirituality, morality, whatever you want to call it, from the youngest days versus someone that has come to it later, but it really is also true in a relativistic sense. If someone is on a spiritual search, person first finds meaning in Jewish tradition. That's a great thing. That's a wonderful thing. But it's also something that is, as I said again, relatively a lot easier than for that individual to continue to find meaning, continue to find new meaning in Jewish tradition. And that I think is our task here. Our task is to, first of all, find that meaning, but number 2, nurture it, reinforce it, so that it always becomes a really important part of our daily lives. All right? What we're talking about is, first we summarize briefly some of the narratives in this week's Torah portion, and we spoke about the fact that in this week's Torah portion we're told about the marriage of Yitzchak and Rebekah. Also, we're led to believe that Rebekah was barren for many years, and both Isaac and Rebekah prayed that Rebekah should be pregnant with child. And what the text tells us is that while both Rebekah and Isaac prayed for a child, when God responds to his voice, to Isaac's voice, rather than that of Rebekah. And why is that? Why is it we have two very, very great people here, two of the ancestors of our people? Why is it that God decided to respond to Isaac and not to Rebekah? And we suggested, based upon Jewish tradition, that Isaac had a much more difficult time to be able to make a meaningful prayer, be able to meaningfully commune with God, than could Rebekah, because he was brought up in a traditional home, and it was not new to him. Rebekah, although she was certainly fully committed to tradition, to religion, but she yet remembered in her earliest days and youngest days, having been brought up in a home that was not traditional, that she had that void in her life. And it was just so much easier for her to be able to summon, that inner spiritual strength that we need to make prayer meaningful. Isaac did not have that experience. He was always brought up with this sense of the importance of prayer, the importance of making God an important part of his life. And it was just so much more difficult for him to be able to manifest that real newness, that novelty, that commitment to prayer. And because he was able to do so, his prayers were that more meaningful to God. Any questions? Any comments? That makes sense? Yeah? Okay. Everyone still awake? Yeah? Just checking. Okay. That was one thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about, I would describe perhaps as a little bit of child psychology that we see already mentioned, already dealt with by the Torah. Just to start off, let's set the stage here. I'm sure we all know the history, we all know the narrative, but let's deal with it anyway. After God responded to Isaac's prayers, and Rebekah had children, she had twins, right? Two sons, Isaac and Jacob, right? Dysfunctional relationship from the start, no question about that. Isaac was someone, and we also find something that really smacks in the face of what we all know to be important parenting, but again, for all kinds of reasons we're not going to get into today, and that is, it seems that the parents played favorites. Isaac loved Esau, right, the older twin, whereas Rebekah favored Jacob. That's what we're told, right? Now the Torah goes beyond this and tells us, why is it that Isaac favored Esau? Why was Esau his favorite son? Remember, our tradition, Esau does not come across as being a very, very likable fellow, right? He's a progenitor of the Arab tradition, the Roman tradition, different possibilities in how his descendants play out. He is related to both traditions, we believe. But the question is, which one predominates? Which one comes from, so to speak, his side? Which side can claim his DNA more than the other? Esau, though, was not a nice fellow. That's clear. Why was he favored by Isaac? So the Torah tells us, I'm quoting more or less literally, that Isaac loved Esau because, well, the way to translate is either because Isaac was provided with food by Esau, or because, and we'll define the pronouns in a minute, he entrapped him verbally. So the standard approach is that Isaac loved Esau because Isaac had, he's described being very wealthy earlier, but as unfortunately happens, we don't need to talk about the present economy as perhaps another example of this, even sometimes wealthy people, unfortunately, sometimes lose a bit of their wealth. And Isaac had reached the point where actually he had difficulty providing himself with food even. What we're told is that Esau, who, by the way, even in our tradition, where he's not regarded as being the best, exemplar, the best role model, right, excelled in showing respect to his father. And what one possibility is that Esau made sure to provide his father with a nourishing meal every day. And the idea is that Esau, as I said, excelled in that area, but he had a lot of moral shortcomings. Isaac failed to see those moral shortcomings because look who's feeding him, right? We talk about, you don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? Is that the idea? Well, sometimes even perhaps the greatest people are not able to look objectively at someone with whom they have such a relationship. That's one approach, all right? There's a second approach which is very similar to this, and that is Not so much that Esau literally gave his father food, but Esau actually, in a premeditated manner, tried to deceive his father. Would go to his father and ask questions. You can imagine, the loyal Jew asking questions of the rabbi. Do you need to tithe? Referring with tithing, right? We had that in our tradition in the times of the temple, and there was actually even reason to believe that it was done in ancient times. Do you need to tithe things like straw and salt? Now, it so happens that in Jewish tradition, tithing is almost exclusively, when it comes to these types of items, it applies only to food items and food items that grow from the ground. So most people don't eat straw, right? It's not considered fit for human consumption. And salt does not grow from the ground. It may be extracted from the ground, doesn't grow. Esau knew the answer to these questions, but he was trying to give his father the picture that he really is as someone who was loyal to the traditions, whereas in reality he was anything but that. So he was trying to mislead his father. Now the question is asked in both these cases. We believe that our ancestors, these people that are described in the Torah, almost without exception, very, very wise, very smart people. So whichever approach you go with, whether Esau literally fed his father, gave his father his sustenance every day, or he tried to mislead him by claiming, that by asking all these questions, which he had no interest in anyway, right? How can Isaac, the great man Isaac, be misled by that? And the answer that's suggested is he might have been very smart. His son was also smart. Son had the same DNA, right? Esau was also very smart, and Esau was guilty in a certain sense of misleading him, and he was successful to a certain extent. That's one approach. That's a standard approach. I'm giving you that as an introduction. What I want to get to, though, is another approach, an approach that I think has interesting meaning for us today, and not only in terms of parenting, but in general. Excuse me. The approach that I want to offer, that I want to suggest to you is when the verse says, again, I'm quoting verbatim here, that Isaac loved Esau because he entrapped him, or he misled him verbally. We have to define who the pronouns are. According to this approach, Isaac was misleading Esau, not Esau misleading Isaac, as we said before. Here's the story, according to this approach, a very interesting approach. Isaac was the wise, wise father. He had 2 sons, he had twins, wasn't worried at all about Jacob, good boy, studious, did what he's supposed to do, probably went to the Hebrew Academy, I would assume, right? I could put a plug in, why not, right? Right? Esau, on the other hand, was the problem child. Esau was the child who's described, whether he's described in not very professional education, he was the wild one. Isaac knew very well about his son's shortcomings, about Esau's shortcomings. He knew that he was not the student. He knew that, he was on the fringe, right, even back then. But he thought to himself the following. I know Esau's coming to me and trying to mislead me with all kinds of questions, questions in Jewish law, questions in tradition. I know very well he has no intention of following them. So what should my reaction be? Well, if I expose him to his face as a fraud, if I show him, listen, I'm on to your game, don't think you're fooling your old man, what am I going to gain? I see that he is so bent on this alternative lifestyle, we'll call it, right, that he is not going to change. He is not going to all of a sudden say, gee, my father disapproves of me, of what I'm doing, I better not act this, I better shape up. Instead, what he's going to do is just going to say, goodbye, Pop, and that's the end of it. If instead I play dumb, if instead I really play along with him, what have I gained? Well, at least I have a connection with him. Maybe at some point in his life there will be some type of emotional upheaval, which all of us go through in our lives, and we all know that, right? That will bring him to the reality that maybe things are not as good as they should be, and maybe then at least he will consider as an option returning to our traditions, and I'll be there to guide him. That is what Isaac did according to this approach. He did not let on. He knew very well. He wasn't fooled for a moment. He didn't let on that he knew anything. He played along with the game while hoping, while praying, no doubt, by the way, right, that Isaac will turn around and come back to his roots. As I said, I think the application of this idea is very self-evident, and it applies not only to the children, but certainly not only to small children. It applies in general. Sometimes we have to know when to let on what we know. Sometimes we have to be careful. We don't want to, be guilty of misleading anyone, obviously. Got to be careful. Always want to be and be perceived as being truthful and above board people. But at certain times, and I'll say certainly as a teacher and as an administrator, sometimes I see certain things done. Student does a certain thing. Do I make a big issue of it? Student doesn't know I saw it. Maybe I'm better off not responding then, not reacting, filing it away, and finding an appropriate time to react in the future if possible.
There are two things, though. Each one of those two examples that you gave, one you didn't give,
which is
that Esau possibly could have truly loved and respected his father, like deep down, his respect for keep it up, aim,
right,
honor your father and mother,
right,
was very important to him, and actually his descendants were rewarded in their wealth because of that one small or large thing.
Right.
So.
Okay, so let me first amplify.
Am I off on
No,
that?
no, you're not. Let me amplify and I'll respond. To give you an idea as to what Jewish tradition says about Esau, and I think, by the way, it's an important lesson also, because we many times get only, I'd say, part of the picture and have this idea that in Jewish tradition someone's either painted as lily white or, the dark force, if I can quote Walt Disney. Disney Studios now, right? Now that they're together. I have a warped sense of humor, I'm sorry. At any rate, so with Esau is considered to be, as I said, on balance, a wicked individual for all kinds of reasons. However, we have a statement in our traditions offered by someone by the name of Rabbi Shimon, the son of Gamliel, who was actually one of the great leaders of the Jewish community around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And what he said is the following. He said, thank you so much, I have never been able to honor my father, is Rabbi Shimon talking, the way Esau did. He's an example. He says, Esau, when he was called to come to his father, when his father summoned him, what he used to do was, he was out in the field working whatever, he would go back, he would change into his finest clothing, and only then would he go to his father. Rabbi Shimon said, me, I don't do that. Why didn't he do that? Because for him to do that would have been an empty act. It's easy to go through the motions, but his point was that Esau really felt deep down in the deep recesses of his heart, of his soul, that it is his greatest honor to serve his father. So there's no question that what you pointed out is correct. On the other hand, according to this approach that I'm suggesting now, that Isaac had caught on to Esau, sometimes we can have great loyalties. And our great loyalties, if they're put to the test, will usually survive. But if you put to the test, the relationship of a son, even a devoted son to his father, and have opposed to that the idea that this son has adopted, again, what I'm calling an alternative lifestyle, it's not so clear to me that most children, even most devoted children, are going to be able to, just at that second, be able to say, well, I would love to do X, Y, and Z. I really want to, I can't stand the restrictions of, a traditional lifestyle, but because of the fact that it will pain my father, I'm not going to go there. That's what I think Isaac was worried about. Isaac was well aware, and according to this approach, I think it feeds in very well. He was well aware of how much Esau honored him and respected him, but he also didn't feel it was worth the risk of trying to test that relationship in this way, to say, Esau, you really like me, you really love me, give up this stuff, get back to where you should be. Right? Get back to Hebrew Academy. Use that as an example. That he wasn't willing to do because he didn't feel that at this point in his development that Esau would be able to withstand that particular test. So that's why I would suggest that we find that. Esau did have other qualities also, by the way. It's just to paint the portrait, and some of this is not actually in this week's portion, so I'm not going to concentrate on it. But there was a point later on, many years ago, when Esau and Jacob reconciled. And we have this tradition that says that Esau was extremely sincere and, to a certain extent, even remorseful for what he had done to Jacob when they finally reconciled many, many years later. So again, I don't want to paint him as a totally negative, caricature. But on the other hand, as I said, in our traditions, he certainly had a lot of very, very negative traits to him. Okay, the last thing that I would like to talk about today is in some ways actually one of my favorite discussion points on any Torah portion throughout the year. So I love it. Hope you do as well. Years later, as I point out in the summary in the beginning, years later, after the incident in which Esau supposedly sold his birthright. Well, remember that story, I presume. He came back from the field one day, and he was very hungry, and he saw that his brother Jacob had prepared this big porridge of soup. We'll talk about why in a moment. And the Torah records that Esau said, pour that stuff down my throat. I'm so weak I can't even, pick up a spoon. Pour it down my throat because I'm really very, very weak. And Jacob said, sure, I'll do that, but first sell your birthright to me. Very strange conversation here, by the way, right? And Esau said, listen, I'm going to die anyway. Take it, right? And then he gets all that he wants. He gets all the food that he wants, all the soup that he wants. Feels super, if you'll pardon the pun, and he leaves. Sorry. Okay? According to our tradition, there was something significant about that soup, that pot of porridge soup, whatever it was, that Jacob was preparing. It's important, by the way, as a lead in here, important to get some historical background. Anyway, the soup that was prepared was being prepared for what is known in Jewish tradition as a meal of consolation. I hope that none of us ever have to observe it, but in Jewish tradition, if one is in mourning for a close relative, when immediately upon return from the burial, the very first meal that one wishes to partake, if one partakes that day, has to follow certain guidelines, ideally. One of them is that certain items are served. Traditionally these days, eggs are served, sometimes lentils, and there's great symbolism to both of them. Eggs and lentils are both round. I guess egg is not a perfect sphere, right? But they're round, and they're supposed to remind us of the cycle of life. The cycle of life includes, of course, cycle of life and death. Jacob was preparing this lentil soup because their father, that is Esau and Jacob's father, Isaac, had just come back from burying his father, their grandfather, Abraham. Esau, according to our traditions, was greatly moved and greatly troubled by the fact that Abraham, his grandfather, had died. And what he thought to himself is the following: how can it be that such a great and righteous man, Abraham, died at such a relatively young age? And there are different discussions to how, he understood that this was a young age. But Abraham, we're told, actually in our tradition, died a few years before his time for various reasons. Esau concluded and said, it's got to be that there really is no God and there really is no judgment. I cannot accept the fact that a righteous God would act this way. And again, I'm probably guilty of exaggerating the point or maybe justifying Esau's point too much, but it in my mind, having grown up in a few decades ago, it reminds me very much of the reaction of many people to the Holocaust. Very, very similar approach. Real honest to goodness, and I'm not for a moment, questioning that, honest to goodness, deep theological questions. Esau refused to accept the fact that there was any possible way that there could be a God who would have allowed this to happen. That's why he sold his birthright. So now you understand why it is, by the way, that Jacob reacted the way he did. It's not as though Jacob was taking advantage of him. God, you come in from the field, you're hungry, I don't care. I'm younger brother, I'm going to do what I can to swindle you. Jacob was horrified. Horrified. This is your reaction to the death of your grandfather, your righteous grandfather. You've decided you are, how do they put it? I guess use mixing metaphors here. You are your own judge, jury, and executioner here. You've decided at the moment that you've heard about this that there's no God. Well, if you've decided that, if you've decided this tradition is not worth anything to you, then please sell me your birthright. In those times, the firstborn had certain prerogatives very similar to the priestly caste, the Kohanim, the Kohens that had later. You don't deserve, this was Jacob's thought to him. Jacob was saying, in effect, you don't deserve that right. You don't deserve to have that honor of serving God in this way, of serving as, the model, representative of the family for these traditions, if you don't believe in them. That's when I asked him to sell it. Anyway, that's just the background. Going later, not many years later, but actually not that long later in our text, Isaac figures, listen, his time may come soon to leave this world. He has these wonderful blessings that had been given to him from his father Abraham, and that had come initially from God. And we believe these blessings have some type of, substance to them, some type of power, some type of strength to them. So he calls in Esau, and he says, Esau, well, prepare me a meal so that I can bless you. Right? Remember the story here. Rebecca overhears this, and here's where, again, you probably see the dysfunctionality of this family to the greatest here, for all kinds of reasons. Rebecca overhears it and says to her son Jacob, says, your father's about to bless your older brother Esau. He doesn't deserve the blessings. You go impersonate him. And Jacob puts up a fight and says, what do you mean impersonate him? He said, why should I do that? And number two, how can I do that? We're different type of individuals. Down to the point that Jacob said, I happen to have smooth skin and my brother has ruddy skin, right? So what did she say? I'll prepare the meal. You take sheepskin, you put some on your arm, you go out and fool your father. Isaac was blind at this point in time, by the way, for all kinds of reasons. And presumably you're dealing with twins that can sometimes, they're identical twins, react and conduct themselves similar ways. He thought he could get away with it. Okay. Going along the lines that we spoke about before, Isaac was not a fool. And he's made out, a simplistic reading of the text. He certainly appears to be one. Well, Jacob comes in. Who's that? So according to the text, just to give you an idea of how far Jewish tradition goes here, the text says, Isaac says, who are you? So if you read the text literally, it says, I am Esau, your firstborn. When someone reads the Torah, ideally, there's supposed to be a pause between I am and Esau's your firstborn. So what he was saying, in effect, is I am who I am, and Esau's your firstborn. A little bit of deception, no doubt. But I used to try to minimize the out-and-out lie. All right? Isaac has difficulties. Come here, let me feel you, and he feels the sheepskin. Okay, passes that test. Okay? But yet the Torah describes the fact that when Jacob came in, that Isaac smelled the sweet smell. So our tradition asks the question, well, if Jacob was wearing sheepskin on his arms, that's not a very sweet smell, is it? It's not a very sweet smell at all. Keep in mind, by the way, that this probably had not had a chance to be, tanning, whatever procedures went here. This is all probably done spur of the moment here, right? I don't think Rebecca was necessarily and had in place here, well, I've got, a costume here from Halloween or Purim, if you prefer, you can put on and you'll look like your brother. So there's probably a horrible smell there. But the Torah goes on and says that Isaac smelled this sweet smell and he blessed Jacob. So the Jewish tradition many times will engage in what I call a play on words. I'm a bit of a punster, but not necessarily this is not in a joking manner. The word in Hebrew for garment, which is where the sweet smell came from, is the word beged. Now, if you remember, from your attendance at services on Yom Kippur, you may remember that on Yom Kippur we say a few confessions a few times. We have two confessions. One of them is done in an alphabet, actually in the Hebrew alphabet, the Aleph Bet arrangement. And the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the letter Bet, right? Beis. I grew up Ashkenazis, I was taught to pronounce it. And the second word that we say in this oral confession, this alphabet confession, is bagadnu. We have rebelled. So the Medrash in Jewish tradition takes this word beged, that Isaac smelled the sweet smell of Jacob's, it was Jacob, of this son's clothing, and says that's not what he did. Instead, he had an encounter with a rebel. What does this mean? So tradition tells us that Isaac was unsure. Does this individual, this son, whoever he is in front, does he really deserve these blessings? God, I want you to, and they could do this back then. Only people in Midtown Manhattan today claim to do this today. We know they're probably certifiable. You can actually ask God for a prophecy. God acceded to his request and gave him a prophecy. And he said, I want to see a descendant of this individual. Tell me, show me, God, this individual should or should not be blessed. And the prophecy that he got settled upon an individual by the name of Yosef Meshita. Yosef Meshita is not a name, excuse me, that you will encounter if you study Jewish history. So I can't tell you whether or not this individual had another name or not, but this individual is described in our tradition as one of the worst rebels, one of the worst traitors. Benedict Arnold, a Quisling, whatever you want to call him, the worst traitors of the Jewish people. The Medrash describes him as leading the Roman armies when they conquered Jerusalem at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, the Roman armies, in the year 68. It describes him as not only leading the charge to conquer Jerusalem, but actually when they got to the Temple Mount, the Romans were afraid to enter the Temple Mount. They had heard stories about how it is that God, excuse me, had performed various miracles, and they said to him, you go in first, and whatever you take out will be yours. He went in, and again, this is this Medrash, this Jewish tradition recounting this, chronicling this, and he came out with the golden candelabra, the menorah. Now you may know, since it's in the news these days, by the way, we all of course hope and pray that things will go well in Israel, and there will be an end to all these horrible, horrible attacks that people in the south and now in the central of the country are subjected to. The menorah serves today. First of all, there's a replica of it outside the Knesset if you've been to Jerusalem, and it also is on the emblem of the state of Israel. So imagine this. A Jew went into the Temple Mount, took out this menorah to bring to the enemies of the Jewish people. This is not someone whom you would think kindly of. The Romans said, okay, we want you to go in again. And whatever you take out will be yours. Well, there were tremendous treasures. The garments of the priest, of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, other treasures there. And they said, we'll let you keep it. We won't confiscate it. We won't tax you for it. And something happened at that point in time. This Yosef Meshisa said, no, I will not go up again. This Medrash records that the Romans offered him the tax receipts for the next 3 years from that entire area. It's not clear, by the way. And if you know, again, a little about history of the times, you know that eventually Palestine was actually, seemed like it was divided into 2 administrative areas, Judea and Galilee. So not clear they meant that area. It didn't mean the whole Roman Empire. But the tax receipts in the next 3 years were his if he would go in again, take something out. Again, just want to remind you that taxes back then were not what they are today. As onerous as they are today, in ancient times, what used to happen is that someone would buy the right to tax the people, pay an exorbitant amount of money to the king, the emperor, who it was, the governor, and that person had the right to confiscate anything and everything that he wanted. So he could easily go up to someone and say, this year's tax, I want your house, and I want your deed, and I want everything in it. So we're talking about a lot of money. This individual, this Yosef Meshisa, refused to go, and here's what he said. He said, according to the Medrash, is it not enough that I've angered my God once? How dare I even think about doing it again? And eventually, he was killed by the Romans on the spot. This is the prophecy that Isaac received, and this, according to this Medrash, this common in Jewish tradition, is what was the final motivation for Isaac to give the blessings to Jacob. I, however, when I studied this, had a question, and that is as follows. Let's remember what the point of this prophecy that Isaac received was. Wanted to show Isaac, this person in front of you, this son standing in front of you, he deserves the blessing. He deserves to be the one to continue this tradition that eventually we call the Jewish tradition. Well, if I wanted to see a descendant of Jacob that would try to convince me to give the blessing to this one, I would not have settled on Yosef Meshisa. Can you think of better candidates than a Jewish tradition to be in the limelight here? Moses was our sainted leader. How many leaders have we had throughout the ages? And you're familiar with the story of Rabbi Akiva, great rabbi, one of the greatest rabbis of his time. Again, became religious, brought up, totally ignorant of Jewish tradition, not observant. 40 years of age, he decided to start studying Torah. Ultimately was killed by the Romans, one of those 10 martyrs that we talk about on Yom Kippur, right? And there are many other great people throughout the ages. Why is it, according to this comment, this tradition, that the prophecy had to settle on this Yosef Mashiach? He did a great thing, no question about it, but look at what he did the rest of his life. And the answer that I would suggest is that what Yosef Mashiach did, what he manifested, does a greater job, a more effective job in defining what our spiritual DNA is made of than any great leader. Every country, every culture has great leaders, no question about that. We have no monopoly on that. But if we try to define what makes us unique as a people, it is, we talk about traveling long distances, and we mentioned before, in terms of comparing Rebecca to Isaac, Jews can have long distances to travel, they can sometimes have shorter distances to travel, but there's one thing that a Jew never loses. It's called in Yiddish, that tintele yid, that spark of Jewishness, that spark of connectedness to our traditions and to our people. One can be as far gone as this Yosef Meshita was. He was certainly way out there. And it doesn't take much to really ignite that spark within each and every one of us to bring us back. And that's what makes us a people, and that's what in many ways defines our uniqueness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, any comments?
That's great.
All right.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for
Very
coming.
nice.
Thank you.